Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alan Herman, and I am one of the Toronto co-chairs for the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research here in Toronto. The other co-chair, who you hopefully already know, is Doris Epstein. And here in Toronto, we have an academic director who is our speaker tonight, and that is Professor Sally Zerker. Now, just to quickly walk you through the approach for tonight, I'm going to introduce the Institute, then I'm going to quickly present Professor Zerker, and then I will hand the floor to her, and afterwards we'll have some questions for her. And looking forward to hearing some of your questions tonight. So, quick word about the Institute. The Canadian Institute for Jewish Research was formed over 30 years ago during the period of the First Palestinian Intifada, at a time when anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism was raging away at the university campuses in Canada. Professor Frederick Krantz and a number of other concerned professors in Montreal took a look at the demonization campaigns happening at the universities, and they saw an inadequate response from the mainstream Jewish community, and they got to work. They organized pro-Israel talks, speaker series, conferences, training programs for faculty and for students. To further counter the vilification of Israel, they first launched an academic publication called the Israfacts, which continues to be published to this day. And then they also published Dateline Middle East, which is a student publication. And on a daily basis, and for many years now, they've issued a daily Israelnet briefing on issues of vital concern to the Jewish world and the Middle East. At the Institute, we don't just want to educate you for the purposes of advocacy. No, we seek to inspire you with the rich and fascinating Jewish story and your role within it. After Professor Zerker's talk, you will see what I mean when I present you with two of our upcoming events. And before I forget, I also would like to thank Ledger Shul Congregation and My Jewish Learning for promoting tonight's talk, as well as any other partners who I've forgotten to mention. So now, Professor Zerker was born in Toronto. She's from here, and she received her PhD in economics from the University of Toronto. Her academic career started at U of T as a lecturer, and then she joined the faculty of York University, where she taught for approximately 30 years. She was the director of Canadian Studies at York in the 1970s and 80s, and following her retirement, she worked as a member of the Ontario Energy Board for 2 terms. She spent a semester teaching at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and also had the opportunity to lecture in China. Her 2 main areas of interest are Canadian economic history and later on, political economy of international oil industry. She's published 2 books and many academic papers in these areas. She was a founding member of the Canadian Professors for Peace in the Middle East and an editor of its journal, The Middle East Focus. She's been with the Institute since its inception, and with that, I now hand the floor and the camera over to Professor Sally Zerker.
Oh.
You can begin, Sally.
I want to get my picture on, if you don't mind. Oh, there it is. Okay. So, good evening, all. It's a little mixed up as we're coming on Streamline. We're not used to this method. I want to tell you, along with Alan, I want to thank you and welcome you to our CIJR, this CIJR program. And I'd much rather be seeing you in person, which we used to do in the olden days when you'd come to the meetings and I could talk to you directly. But times have changed and we must change whether we like it or not. For me, speaking to you this way is a completely new experience. It's different, it's interesting, and very challenging. My topic, which you've all seen in the flyer that you've received more than once, is Zionism, a Jewish birthright. And I start here tonight where my idea on this subject started. Excuse me. I had a revelation recently about the place of Zionism in Jewish life. The origin of that breakthrough was initially hatched during a recent talk I gave, where I made reference to my birth family and its attachment to Zionism. I said at that lecture, and the lecture was also a CIJR forum, that when you were born a Friedberg, you were thereby born a Zionist, and that was true. It was a truthful reflection of my family's attachment to the land of Israel historically in those days. And of course, our attachment since we were young, we were born in the 1920s, my youngest sister in the 1930s, but that attachment was of course historical. And since 1948 to the reality of Israel's rebirth. Subsequently, however, it struck me that this is true for any Jewish child when he or she is born, that a Jewish child is born a Zionist. Now, how do I arrive at what some, or more likely many, would call this an astonishing postulation? It came to me from a familiar happening for most Jews, and I mean Jews who are secular, Jews who are traditional, Jews who are Orthodox. And this is true, what I'm saying is something that almost all Jews practice. And that is attendance at a Passover Seder every year. When celebrating Passover, Jews are together recognizing the liberation of Jews from slavery in the ancient land of Egypt, probably 4,000 years ago. And we are reminded of this happening when we read the Haggadah at the gathering of modern Jews. And we are supposed to vicariously experience both slavery and our deliverance from that suffering. Whether you and I can manage that mental transformation, it is not relevant. The concept of enslavement and salvation is readily understandable. Now, for a moment, I want to digress here about memory for Jews. Memory is fundamental to the eternity of the Jewish people. We not only celebrate happy events like Passover, Purim, Hanukkah, but we also remember and mourn the suffering and loss of Jews that Jews experienced over millennia. And that recently was expressed at Tisha B'Av, where we mourned the destruction twice, I said it plurally, the destructions twice of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Jews have done this on an annual basis for centuries, and in effect, it connected Jews in their dispersal to Israel and Jerusalem. I do remember the sorrow experienced by some Jews as if they were there, and they literally cried as if they felt the pain and the loss. Now back to the Pesach Seder. There is another part of the Seder story that is very important. It is the traditional proposition that Jewish peoplehood began with the Exodus from Egypt. That's a position widely held. The story depicts the survival of those Jewish refugees living together for 40 years in the wilderness. And it suggests the possibilities of the arrangement for the bonding process to take place over generations. Recently, I've taken to studying Talmud by the day. It's called Daf Yomi. And I came across an interesting written confirmation of this traditional view about the bonding of and the creation of the peoplehood in the Exodus from Egypt. It's in Daf Brachot 36b, if you want to know the source. Rabbi Yehuda said that when Moses took leave of Israel on his last day in the world, this is what he said: "Keep silence and hear, Israel. This day you become a people unto the Lord your God." And here is expressed the point of that troublesome living and surviving together was preparation for the Jewish people, excuse me, to enter and settle the promised land, Zion or Zion, which I prefer, the land that subsequently came to be called Eretz Yisrael and today known as Israel. And this is the Jewish version of the origin of a Jewish people and its place in the world. As for dating it, in the Torah, we learn of a united Israel monarchy that started in the 10th century BCE. But the tribes of Israel were settled there at least 400 years before the establishment of the monarchy. And we learned about that from the book of Judges. Outside of the Torah, for example, the name Israel first appears in an Egyptian stele in circa 1200 BCE. So that by whatever account you choose, it is clear that Jews have been identified as a people connected with Eretz Yisrael for more than 3,000 years. And Jews have never left the land yet. Yes, they were conquered and experienced population expulsions numerous times over the centuries by Babylonians, by Syrians, by Romans, by Muslims, and by Christian crusaders. And sometimes these happened more than once by these actors. Nevertheless, Jews retained and rebuilt communities in Jerusalem, Tiberias, Rafah, Gaza, Ashkelon, Jaffa, Caesarea, Sfat, and many other locations. I didn't list them all. Years before the modern Zionist migration began in the 1870s, Jews lived continuously over time throughout the land of Israel. Now, before I continue on this thesis, I know that some people hearing or reading my concepts about the innate Jewish Zionist condition are disbelieving, even perhaps annoyed. After all, we're all fully aware that many Jews openly declare their opposition to Zionism. However, I am not suggesting that this distinction disqualifies them as Jews, any more than those Jews who ignore kashrut, or Jews who don't pray 3 times a day, or Jews who do not abide by Sabbath restrictions are thereby disbarred from Judaism. My point is, these obligations are part and parcel of their Jewish birth package, which I'm now arguing includes commitment to Zion. Choosing not to abide by one or all of them doesn't negate their identity as Jews. But my interest in the origin of Zionism and its connection to Jews at birth is particularly relevant in our own day. In the light of the prevalence of the most vigorous form of anti-Semitism currently very active. That long-standing bigotry now is manifested in the hatred of the Jewish state of Israel, as well as hatred of people like me who are Zionists. So we're talking about hatred of the Jewish homeland and Jewish Zionists. This new, and we'll put it in quotation marks, this new anti-Semitism is institutionalized in the academia. It's also is found in the so-called social justice movement. We find it among the more radical US Democratic Party leaders, in Jewish left-wing organizations, in, of course, the United Nations, both generally and specifically, and others like the right-wing or old right-wing organization that always hated Jews. What makes this anti-Semitism new, and this is very important, is that it is presented as legitimate. Different from the old anti-Semitism because there is the pretense that this is only about an evil, occupying, colonial, and apartheidic power, and is unconnected with its Jewish content. Of course, since this obsession with elimination of the one Jewish state in the world out of 200 states, many with horrendous human rights records, exposes the true anti-Semitic nature of this so-called new Zionism, a new version of anti-Semitism. Sorry about that. As well, since to be at one with Zion is part of the innate character of the Jew, as I've argued, to be anti-Israel is inexorably to espouse anti-Semitism. I've heard, this is something I find, I've heard Jews say that they wish there had never been an Israel. And I ask why, and it comes down to the fact that they're embarrassed about having to deal with this order of disapproval from the world around them. But I regard this, you can see why I regard a statement like that also as anti-Semitic. So with the so-called legitimacy of the new anti-Semitism, it's here. And it's readily available to be transformed into the old standard of hatred of individual Jews and their institutions. It's there, ready to be revised backwards. And it has, in fact. We now find it everywhere. All parts of the UK are infested, most persistently and awful in Ireland. And I'm going to tell you a weird story talking about this anti-Semitism. April Powers, that's a person who's a Jewish diversity officer with the Children's Book Writers, was forced to resign. Why? Because she didn't mention Islamophobia in a statement which she issued about the rise of anti-Semitism. It's a new twist in anti-Semitism. Everything and anything goes nowadays. The universities are swamped with anti-Semitic personnel and tactics. In Toronto, all three universities have revealed serious anti-Semitic incidents. At the moment, U of T is involved in a typical old-fashioned Jew hatred approach, where a faculty association, which expresses its hatred of Israel, didn't get its way in hiring someone they favored, or one who a person who was objectively deemed unqualified for the job. But this faculty association nevertheless backed her because she had a reputation as someone notoriously hostile to Israel. So they wanted her to have joined their group. Now, in a well-known anti-Semitic tactic, the fault for their failure to get her is due, as they said, and this is typical of what we're familiar with, is due to, quote, powerful Zionist minority, a powerful Zionist minority that supposedly dominates U of T policy. Well, we know that's utter nonsense, and I could go and explain to you where it all came from and where it's all going, but I haven't got enough time for such detail. So we go back to the York University and Ryerson, and we find that each have had their own record of falsehoods and mistreatment of Jewish matters. But don't get me wrong, this hatred is not confined to Toronto and Canada. There's much worse abroad. I'll give you an example. Hundreds of Ivy League Princeton University professors and students, hundreds, produced and signed a statement condemning Israel's Jewish supremacy and its ongoing attack on Gaza. But along with it, you're not allowed to, they object to if you somehow balance that statement with condemnation of Gaza's missiles attack, the Hamas missile attacks on Israel. Because that, they say, is not appropriate because Palestinians are under the heel of Israeli oppression. So it's just a one-sided war made on innocent Hamas individuals and their people. There's more, of course, and that's not the only place. UCLA Asian American Department condemns Israel as a settler colonialism. And when you look, you find it pretty much all over the place. Recently, Middle East Forum, which is a very good source for very good research work and writing. They had an article about Princeton, Brown University, and Harvard, documenting very serious and critical views of Israel that were fundamentally unbalanced against this Gaza outbreak. But the works let me just say that there's, if you look, you'll find it everywhere. You'll find it in California, the universities. You'll find it in American universities elsewhere, and you'll find it in European as well. So I'm sorry to tell you, there's a lot of this. It's not I'm using a couple of examples that are indicative of other practices elsewhere. But the worst consequences of this outbreak of anti-Semitism is that Jewish students here and abroad tell us that they are afraid to wear identifiable Jewish ornaments or dress for fear of being attacked physically and orally. A Jewish advisor to President Biden recently suggested on social media that American Jews ought to consider taking off their yarmulkes and other outward symbols of Jewishness. So it's not just students. These are about Jewish symbols elsewhere on the streets. And we know that synagogue leaders are fearful as well, because we see that all of them hire protection personnel and devices. This will really astonish you. French courts have recognized inebriation as a legitimate alibi for murdering Jews and Holocaust survivors. Inebriation, he's drunk, so he can do it, or she. French Jews are scared and emigrating in significant numbers. I find the fear like this is very telling, because while I grew up in anti-Semitic Toronto, and it was, and Canada, which it was, we weren't afraid of being attacked for being Jewish. Big and small synagogues did not have protective arrangements that I recall. And when I was young, we went to the Hebrew school, the Talmud Torah on Brunswick, their college. And they had classes in night hours as well as daytime. I walked at least 2 miles in the dark in the winter months to attend Cheder, with no fear due to my obvious Jewish connections. Now, I'm not saying I wasn't afraid going past the blacked out Christie Pits, because we lived on the other side of Christie Pits from the Talmud Torah. But that wasn't due to any anti-Jewish threat. Now, I may be giving you an impression about how we lived without fear that isn't accurate by some others' perception, but that's how I see it now. My own adult children, and they're in their 60s, and so they're not children, and their spouses, also that age, cannot fathom that this irrational disease, Jew hatred, is now prevalent in their world. They were all knowledgeable about anti-Semitism, but they had no experiences directly or indirectly with this madness. The shock, and it is a shock for them, is that it is not generated by some alien, ignorant, or fascistic society, but by their own and others' sophisticated, educated, supposedly socially humane societies where it's found. The FSWC, that's the Simon Wiesenthal organization, writes this: "This is not a Canada you and I recognize, where anti-Jewish incidents are happening every day. So it's no wonder Jewish youth and others and adults are uncertain and troubled." Sadly, I have to say that Jewish organizations are no better prepared to deal with this outbreak of anti-Semitism. We see confusion and misunderstanding of the source. American Jewish leadership, for example, cannot even agree on what constitutes anti-Semitism. You know, we have a widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism that has been accepted internationally at lots of organizations, but also governments. That definition is being challenged by Jewish leaders committed to the leftist point of view against Israel, and have come up with a meaningless definition of anti-Semitism that is supposedly an appropriate expression of Jewish values as follows. Here it is. Here's just a little bit of it. We stand against all hatred. We know we cannot truly defeat anti-Semitism if we allow other forms of hatred within our midst. This coalition will not tolerate expressions of racism, Islamophobia, misogyny, etc., etc., etc. So anti-Semitism gets swallowed up in racism. It gets swallowed up in a barrage of problems that are not in any way or necessarily connected to anti-Semitism. I'm saying that the basic root, and I'm not talking about the cause, the basic root for this frightening outbreak is the misrepresentation of Israel's legitimacy, legally, historically, and now I add my thesis, that of Jewish birthright to the land of Israel. I see it as yet another building block to the evidence for Jewish authentic attachment to the land. Such Jewish attachment to the land of Israel is exactly what the Palestinians have tried to obliterate by all and many means, offering fantastic fabrications intended to replace Jewish history with Palestinian manifestations, like the denial of a historical Jewish temple over again. They also talk about themselves, the Palestinians, that are the true original Phoenicians, maybe Canaanites, and so on. But Palestinians are not only speaking falsely, they are seizing Jewish heritage sites and demolishing valuable archaeological findings. A recent case is one in which the Palestinian Authority seized the Hasmonean era fortress in Samaria and converted it into a Palestinian tourist site. This site is in fact Tel Aruma, mentioned in the Bible as the city of Avimelech, which was the northernmost fortress of the Jewish state during the Hasmonean period. So what I'm saying is the PA has declared war not only on the Jewish state, but on Jewish history. And there's a very good reason for their falsifying their own origin and destroying important Jewish sites. If the truth of Jewish origin and habitation is not undermined and repudiated, how will that choice Palestinian and leftist propaganda, that is what I'm talking about, Jewish occupation of the land of Israel, how will that endure? It has been the most occupation has been the most effective lie that has permeated the most unlikely places of power and opinion. And we find it amongst Jews as well, which I'm sad to say. So this is a word, occupation, that has been somewhat obliterated by all the effective propaganda against Israel. The Germans occupied Europe during World War II. That was occupation. It was theft of others' property, non-rightful rule of territory, abuse of domination, etc. Other too. But Jews are not and cannot be guilty of these crimes. It's not only that the Jewish people identified with this land for more than 3,000 years, it is also the case that the evidence, past and present, demonstrates that Jews are the extant, and I say that again, the extant Aboriginal people of the land of Israel. The Jewish record of connection throughout the ages is remarkable. And it is one that I think is unique. And I don't use that word unique loosely. I've done lots of looking around, and I am continually in awe with this story about Jewish connections. What defines Jewish aboriginality is the consistency of modern Jews with their ancestors of thousands of years ago. And here's the list that really awes me. They live in a country with the same name, Israel, as that which existed 1312 BCE. Today's Israelis speak the same language that was spoken by Jews in that land more than 3,000 years ago, as I've said before, other places today. And we don't need a Rosetta Stone to understand Hebrew scripts that are found now often archaeological digs, because the language and letters are the same as current Hebrew. Israelis chant from the same biblical texts that their ancestors did millennia past. Their Jewish law presently is derived from that found in their Talmud, which was originally oral and later written down about 2,000 years ago. Their temple, which was destroyed by invaders twice, as we've mentioned tonight, can be archaeologically located in their original sites in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, which was founded by the biblical King David, still stands as the center of Jewish sovereignty, as it did when King David ruled the Jews. That's why I say it's unique. I was thinking about it lots of times, and I looked into Egypt. Well, Egypt doesn't speak its own language. I looked into Persia, Rome, Greece. Greece is probably the closest, because if the scholars of ancient Greek can probably read the ancient texts. I don't think the ordinary everyday Greek, but it doesn't have the kind of consistency that I just read to you about the Jewish people who established a distinct civilization in their ancient homeland, 3,500 years ago? The roots of that civilization are still much of the source of Jewish life in Israel today. Don't you find that amazing? I do. So to conclude tonight, my talk, recognition of the Jewish inborn nature of Zionism, I hope, would affect understanding and behavior for both Jews and non-Jews. For example, Jews who think that Judaism is detached from its national factor. It's a religion, but it's not connected necessarily to being a nation. Well, if one looks at this concept that I've been talking about tonight, then it can't be unconnected to the nation of Israel, to Zion. For Christians and Muslims who view Judaism as a foundational influence, this edition of original Zionism is an important understanding of the place of Israel from the early ages of that founding religion. So, as we will once again retrace the story of Exodus in the weekly readings in the synagogues all over the world, and when Jews recall and relive slavery and liberation at their Pesach Seders, this is also the time and place to renew their sense of peoplehood and its connection to Eretz Yisrael. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm looking forward sometime in the future to seeing you all personally. Thank you. I'm still here because, oh, here comes Alan.
Hello. Professor Zerker, Sally, thank you very much for that presentation. That was excellent, and you have given real food for thought for all of us about Zionism and our relationship to it. There is a number of questions that have come in for you by email, and we're also starting to receive a few questions through the YouTube chat. And anyone who is currently online who would like to ask a question, please feel free to enter a question in the YouTube chat, and Andre, who's monitoring, will forward them along to us. So to begin with some of the questions we had by email, Professor Zerker, do you have suggestions for how to inspire people with Zionism? And perhaps closely related to this question, does one need to be religious to be a Zionist?
No, of course not. But I didn't hear the first part of your question, so say that again, please.
I will be happy to say that again. The first part of the question is, do you have suggestions for inspiring people with Zionism?
The inspiration for people has to be, oh, there's so many parts to this story. I can't really, it's education, it's knowledge, it's going to Israel, it's thinking about your connections to the Jewish people. I mean, it's a multiple aspect and possibility, and all of that enriches everybody's life, as it has enriched mine and yours, Alan. And the other part of the question was?
The other part of the question, which you answered up front, was, does one need to be religious?
No, of course not. I mean, you can see
I believe I heard you say,
Zionists who are actually the head of the pro-Israel organization, Professors for Peace in the Middle East, was Professor Harry Crow, who wasn't Jewish. And he was a very passionate Zionist. So it's not even that you don't even necessarily have to be Jewish.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. We have a question that has come in from YouTube, the YouTube chat, and I'm just going to dig it up. The question is, Professor Zerker, do you feel that sufficient evidence could convince academic opponents of Israel?
Well, academics have the evidence in most cases. They don't want to study it seriously, I don't think. They have the answers that have been integrated into their thinking, an ideology that takes precedent over knowledge. So those academics that saw 4,500 missiles shot at civilians in Israel, all over, and even as far as Jerusalem, those academics that think that this is a war that Israel is responsible for, they don't have to have a lot of knowledge to know that that's ridiculous. It didn't get started by Israel, and it didn't get ended until the Hamas warriors stopped sending the missiles. So the knowledge is there, but the desire desire for the truth isn't there.
I feel the wind taken out of my sails with that answer. But
Okay.
fair enough. That sounds like the straight goods. I have another question for you, and this also comes from the YouTube chat. You touched on this in your presentation, but please feel free to elaborate. How does one combat the frightening anti-Semitism on the university campuses today?
How does one, oh, that's difficult. That's very difficult. I know the students that I know who have undertaken to defend Israel on the campuses are very brave. It takes a lot of courage today to stand up against the voices of your professors, the voices of the student organizations, if they have already demonstrated that they're not interested in the truth, that they're interested in this point of view, and that's all. There are kids who do it, and it's amazing when they do, and they usually have to have some backing from professors, which is hard, because most professors today, there are not a lot of conservative professors around the campuses in North America, as far as I could tell. And it wasn't that way at York, but when by the time I retired, it was becoming that way. So how to do it, as if you have the courage to do it, and if you're a student and you have that kind of commitment, that is very important, that this does not continue without challenge. And if you can get some help, either from the professors or from student organizations or from the general Jewish organizations, which they should draw on if they looked to make a difference. But it is difficult, and I have great respect for all the students who do. They're not many because it's too hard, and they're afraid of being punished in their grades and in their graduation.
Thank you for that answer. This is a question that you certainly addressed in your presentation, but this came in by email in advance of your presentation, and I'm sure there are people who joined in at different times during your talk tonight. So would you mind giving an answer to this particular question? The Arabs claim that they were indigenous. Could you speak to that? How true is that? How true isn't that? Again, I know you presented this in your presentation, but could you give us an answer to this?
I could give you an answer. That's an easy answer. They can't have been indigenous. The Arab Empire only began after Muhammad died, which is in the 7th century after CE. Okay, he died around 300. I mean, that seems to me. I used to know the exact date, but it was something like 634, 636. I'm not sure exactly, but it was around that time. Then after he died, the very successful military move by his followers to conquer the world they knew, which was mostly around the Mediterranean at first, because they came out of the Arabian Peninsula. That's where they're from. And they didn't get to Jerusalem until about the end of the 7th century. Now we're talking about the aboriginality of the Jewish people, which brings me back to 4,000 years ago, something like that, okay? When the peoplehood came to, the Jews were not the first people on the land. We knew about Canaanites, although just recently my brother was telling me about that there were Jews amongst the Canaanites, but he knows a lot, but I don't know, I cannot give you that evidence, but it just so happened that we were talking about it. Anyway, the Arabs that are part of this story came originally in the 7th century, when it was long past the time that they could be the Aboriginal people. Long past, and I gave you all the different peoples that conquered there, aside from the Jews and before them, the Canaanites. Okay. Is that a sufficient answer for you?
You know, I drive a hard bargain. Yes, that was an excellent answer. Thank you, Professor Zerker. But if you have, we've got one more question for you.
Okay.
And that question is, perhaps right on the heels of the one you've just given, this is an appropriate question. Where could economic partnership with progressive Arab nations like the UAE, where could this lead?
Oh, I think it could lead to a total transformation. It's already happening. And why I say that, in this last outbreak with Hamas, the Arab world did not come to Hamas's support at all. If you think back on it, not at all. And of course, there's a reason, and the reason that there is this alliance with it's now 6 Arab countries, but the reason, because there's Egypt and Jordan as well. The reason there is that alliance and the growth of that alliance in recent time is because indeed the Palestinians have really not taken advantage of all the help that they've been given, both by Israel and by the outside world. Fortunes have been donated to the Palestinians and given from the United States, from Europe, from all, and I'm talking about billions of dollars have been fed into the Palestinians. And what has happened with it? They haven't used it to develop their economies. On the contrary, the economies have suffered a great deal. The evidence, too, is we're talking about what the outcome can be. The outcome can be that somehow, can I digress for a minute in answering this question? The worst thing that was ever done, and it was just recently written about by Karsh. The worst thing that was done by Israel was to make that deal, the Oslo deal, because they rescued Arafat and his thugs, 20,000 thugs, brought them back to the area of with the PA, and integrated their mentality of no, their mentality of terrorism against Israel, their mentality of never solving the problem in any kind of rational and legitimate partnership. So what I perceive is the possibility, and it's not around the corner, but it's a possibility. As the surrounding Arab countries become integrated economically and in other ways with Israel, somehow the message may get to the Palestinians that their only hope is to deal with the problem in a rational way. They can't have transfer of the populations to Israel. They can't have all the things that they say are essential because it just won't happen. And even when they were offered everything that they now wish they had taken, I know they say that are some people amongst the Palestinians, the ones who are honest and realistic, they say they missed big opportunities, which they did. But they only hope for Palestinians and for the solution of the Palestinian-Israel the Arab and Jewish conflict of 100 years. And that's what it is, at least 100 years. The only hope for it is that there should be a sensible, realistic, and hopeful and honest approach of the Palestinians that they learn from their fellow Arabs around them who are making deals with Israel. Thank you for that question.
And thank you for that answer, Professor Zerker, because I think we have your next subject for your next presentation for us. So with that, thank you for answering all of our questions here tonight, Professor Zerker. That was greatly appreciated. It's been thorough. It was reflective. You got to the heart of the issues. And on behalf of all of us who are on this call tonight, thank you very much for this. And before, just a quick note to change gears.
Yeah, I want to just say one thing. Alan, thank you very much for all the effort you put in setting this up. I know there was a lot of work for you to do. You really do lead this Toronto chapter of the CIJR. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope no one can see me blushing too much right now from that kind words. Now, that being said, before everyone leaves, please, I promised before that there were two fascinating events that I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to speak about them very quickly. And then, because I know that they are events you will not want to miss out on. We have two upcoming events. In October, the exact date is still to be confirmed, but in October, and stay tuned with us because we will shore that date up shortly, we will be hosting a panel discussion based on a book that the Institute has published. And the book that we published is Zionism, an Indigenous Struggle, Aboriginal Americans, and the Jewish State. In October, we will bring you speakers who are both Jewish and Indigenous, and we'll speak about the relationship with Zionism, with Judaism, Israel, and their native identities. You will not want to miss out on that, and there's no charge for that event. Even sooner, more immediately, on August 22nd, our gala speaker is Yosef Haddad, who is Arab and Christian, and he is a defender of Israel. Yosef Haddad is from Haifa. He volunteered to serve in the Israel Defense Forces at the age of 18. In 2006, while serving in the IDF during the Second Lebanon War, his foot was blown off and reattached, and he relearned how to walk and run again. He co-founded the organization Vouching for Each Other, which includes Jews, Christians, Muslim, Druze, and Bedouins. And its goal is to bridge gaps of mistrust and to help Arab Israelis become more a part of Israeli society. You will not want to miss out on the experience of his inspirational talk, so please visit Israelnet.org today to confirm your ticket for this presentation. And that said, I emailed all of you individually before tonight's talk. If you had any questions that you did not have a chance to ask, please email me and we'll be glad to pass them on to Professor Zerker. And with that, thank you all very much for attending tonight. Once again, Professor Zerker, thank you. Thank you to all the volunteers who have made tonight possible. And thank you all for attending. Have a wonderful night and see you again very